Little black girl sob and begs. Don't hurt me. Suddenly her billionaire father visit home and shout. The smell of burnt toast and stale cigarettes hung heavy in the cramped apartment like a suffocating blanket. 8-year-old Naomi pressed herself against the peeling wallpaper in the narrow hallway, her small fingers clutching a worn sketchbook that had become her only escape from the world that seemed determined to crush her spirit. Through the thin walls, she could hear her mother, Lisa, shuffling around the kitchen in her worn-out slippers, getting ready for her second job of the day. The morning shift at the diner had already drained the life from her eyes, but the evening cleaning job at the office building downtown waited for no one. Bills didn't pay themselves, and Carl, her stepfather, certainly wasn't going to help with anything except emptying another beer bottle. Naomi, baby, come eat your cereal before it gets soggy, Lisa called out, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been running on fumes for years. Naomi tiptoed into the kitchen, her bare feet silent against the cold linoleum floor. She had learned long ago that making noise was dangerous, especially when Carl was around. The man sat slouched at the small kitchen table, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the television screen where some talk show was playing. Empty beer cans formed a small pyramid beside his elbow, and it wasn't even noon yet. There she is, Carl mumbled without looking at her, his words slightly slurred. The little princess finally decided to grace us with her presence. Lisa shot him a warning look while stirring sugar into her coffee. She's just a child, Carl. Leave her alone. Just a child who eats our food and uses our electricity, he grumbled, finally turning his glazed eyes toward Naomi. What's that you're holding there, girl? That stupid drawing book again? Naomi instinctively hugged her sketchbook tighter to her chest. Inside its pages lived her dreams, drawings of beautiful houses with big windows, families laughing together around dinner tables, and most importantly, a little girl who looked just like her but was always smiling. In her drawings, bruises didn't exist, and neither did men who smelled like beer and disappointment. It's nothing, she whispered, sliding into the chair farthest from Carl. Nothing? Carl's voice rose slightly, and Naomi felt her stomach clench. I work hard to put food on this table, and you sit there scribbling in that book all day like some kind of artist. You think you're better than us? Carl, please, Lisa said, checking the clock on the wall. I have to leave in 10 minutes. Can we just have one peaceful morning? But Naomi knew there was no such thing as a peaceful morning in this house. There hadn't been for the 3 years since Carl moved in with his promises of taking care of them. The only thing he took care of was making sure the refrigerator stayed stocked with beer and that everyone in the apartment walked on eggshells around his unpredictable moods. She ate her cereal in silence, each spoonful feeling like cardboard in her mouth. The milk had gone slightly sour, but she didn't dare complain. Complaining led to lectures about being ungrateful. Lectures led to Carl getting angry. And when Carl got angry, things got broken, sometimes dishes, sometimes furniture, and sometimes the delicate hope that lived in Naomi's heart. I'll be back around midnight, Lisa said, grabbing her worn purse from the counter. She bent down to kiss Naomi's forehead, her lips cold and chapped. Be good, okay? Help Carl if he needs anything. Naomi nodded, though the thought of being alone with Carl made her feel sick. Lisa's presence, however exhausted and distant, was the only barrier between Naomi and the full force of Carl's increasingly volatile temperament. After the door clicked shut behind her mother, the apartment fell into an uncomfortable silence broken only by the drone of the television and Carl's occasional grunt of disapproval at whatever was happening on screen. Naomi finished her cereal as quickly as possible and started to slip away to her room, a tiny space she shared with her mother's sewing supplies and boxes of things they couldn't afford to throw away but had nowhere else to put. Where do you think you're going? Carl's voice stopped her cold. To my room, she said quietly, not turning around. Your room? Carl laughed, but there was no humor in it. This is my apartment, girl. Everything in it belongs to me. That includes you. The words sent ice through Naomi's veins, but she had heard them before. Carl liked to remind both her and her mother that they were living in his space, eating his food, breathing his air. Never mind that Lisa worked 2 jobs to pay most of the rent and all of the groceries. Never mind that Naomi tried to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She made it to her corner of the bedroom and opened her sketchbook to a fresh page. Drawing was the only thing that quieted the storm inside her head, the only way she could create a world where she had control over what happened next. Her pencil moved across the paper, creating the outline of a house, not the cramped apartment with its stained walls and broken dreams, but a real house with a garden and a swing set and windows that let in actual sunlight. Hours passed in blessed quiet. Carl seemed to have fallen asleep in his chair, judging by the sound of his labored snoring coming from the living room. Naomi allowed herself to relax slightly, adding details to her drawing. She gave the house a red front door and drew flowers blooming in neat rows along the walkway. In one of the upstairs windows, she sketched a little girl waving, herself, but in a world where waving meant joy instead of goodbye. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade when Naomi heard Carl stirring in the other room. Her shoulders tensed automatically, a learned response to the sound of his movements. She heard the refrigerator open and close, followed by the distinctive hiss of a beer can opening. Then another. And another. By the time evening arrived, Carl's mood had shifted from sluggish indifference to something darker and more dangerous. Naomi could hear him muttering to himself, occasionally raising his voice at the television as if the people on screen could hear his commentary. She tried to stay as quiet as possible, but her stomach was growling loudly enough that she worried he might hear it. Gathering all her courage, she crept to the kitchen to look for something to eat. Lisa had left some leftover soup in the refrigerator, and there was half a loaf of bread on the counter. Naomi was reaching for a bowl when her elbow knocked against a glass that was sitting too close to the edge of the counter. The glass seemed to fall in slow motion, tumbling through the air before shattering against the floor in an explosion of orange juice and broken pieces. The sound echoed through the small apartment like a gunshot. "What the hell was that?" Carl's voice boomed from the living room, followed by the sound of his heavy footsteps stomping toward the kitchen. Naomi stared at the mess at her feet, frozen with terror. The orange juice was spreading across the linoleum like a small sunset, and pieces of glass glittered in the overhead light like tiny diamonds. She wanted to clean it up, to fix it somehow, but her hands were shaking too badly to move. Carl appeared in the doorway, his face flushed red with anger and alcohol. His eyes took in the scene, the broken glass, the spilled juice, and Naomi standing in the middle of it all like a deer caught in headlights. "You clumsy little brat," he snarled, stepping into the kitchen. "Look what you've done! Look at this mess!" "I'm sorry," Naomi whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was an accident. I'll clean it up." "Sorry?" Carl's laugh was cruel and sharp. "Sorry doesn't fix my glass. Sorry doesn't clean up this mess. You know what your problem is? You think you can just float through life without consequences." He was getting closer now, and Naomi could smell the beer on his breath mixing with something else, something mean and ugly that seemed to pour out of him when he got like this. She took a step backward and felt a piece of glass crunch under her bare foot. The pain was sharp and immediate, but she didn't dare cry out. "Please," she whispered, looking up at his angry face. "I'll be more careful. I promise." But Carl was beyond listening to promises. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin hard enough to leave marks. Naomi felt tears spring to her eyes as he squeezed tighter, lifting her arm until she was forced onto her tiptoes. "You need to learn some respect," he growled, his other hand rising into the air above her head. "Maybe then you'll think before you go destroying other people's property." Naomi saw his hand coming down toward her and felt something break inside her chest, not just fear, but the last small piece of hope she had been carrying that maybe, somehow, things would get better on their own. The tears came freely now, streaming down her cheeks as she looked up into the face of the man who was supposed to protect her but instead had become the thing she feared most. "Don't hurt me," she sobbed, the words torn from somewhere deep inside her soul. "Please don't hurt me." The words hung in the air between them like a prayer and an accusation all at once. For just a moment, something flickered across Carl's face, maybe recognition, maybe shame, but then his expression hardened again, and his hand continued its downward arc. Just as his palm was about to connect with her tear-streaked cheek, the front door of the apartment exploded inward with a crash that shook the walls and sent pictures rattling in their frames. "Stop right there!" The voice that filled the apartment was like thunder, deep, commanding, and absolutely furious. Both Carl and Naomi froze, his hand still suspended in the air above her head, as a figure filled the doorway like an avenging angel dressed in an expensive suit. The man was tall and powerful, with shoulders that seemed to take up the entire door frame. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the obvious urgency that had brought him here, and his eyes, the same warm brown as Naomi's, blazed with a fury that made Carl's anger look like a child's tantrum. "Get your hands off my daughter!" the stranger said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow seemed even more threatening than if he had been shouting. Carl's grip on Naomi's wrist loosened slightly, but he didn't let go completely. His alcohol-fogged brain struggled to process what was happening. The stranger in the expensive suit looked completely out of place in their rundown apartment, like a lion that had wandered into a chicken coop. "Who the hell are you?" Carl slurred, trying to puff out his chest in a show of dominance that would have been laughable if the situation weren't so dangerous. "This is my home, and you're trespassing." The man stepped further into the apartment, his polished leather shoes crunching over the broken glass that still littered the kitchen floor. Up close, Naomi could see the fine details that spoke of wealth: the perfectly tailored suit, the expensive watch catching the overhead light, the way he carried himself like someone who was used to being obeyed without question. But it was his eyes that held her attention. They were exactly like hers, down to the little golden flecks that appeared when the light hit them just right. Looking at him was like seeing herself in a magic mirror that showed her what she might look like 20 years from now, if she were tall and strong and powerful instead of small and scared and broken. "I said let go of her." The stranger's voice was steel wrapped in silk, each word carefully enunciated despite the rage burning behind his controlled facade. "Now." Something in his tone made Carl's survival instincts finally kick in through the alcohol haze. His hand dropped from Naomi's wrist as if she had suddenly caught fire. She stumbled backward, her injured foot leaving small drops of blood on the linoleum as she pressed herself against the refrigerator, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Look, mister, I don't know who you think you are," Carl started, but his bravado was cracking around the edges. "But that little girl is none of your business. Her mother and I are raising her just fine." The stranger's laugh was cold and bitter. "Raising her? Is that what you call grabbing a child hard enough to leave bruises? Is that what you call terrorizing an 8-year-old girl in her own home?" Naomi watched in fascination as Carl's face cycled through several different expressions: confusion, anger, fear, and finally a kind of desperate cunning that she recognized from his worst moments. "You don't know what you're talking about," Carl said, taking a step backward as the stranger advanced. "Kids need discipline. They need to learn respect. Her mother agrees with me." "Her mother?" The stranger's voice dropped even lower, if that were possible. "Tell me, where is Lisa right now? Working her second job while you sit here drinking and taking your frustrations out on a child?" Carl's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. How could this stranger know about Lisa's work schedule? How could he know anything about their lives? Naomi found her voice for the first time since the man had appeared. "Who are you?" she whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The stranger's fierce expression softened instantly when he looked at her. He crouched down slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might frighten her further. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, completely different from the commanding tone he had used with Carl. "My name is Richard Hale," he said, and Naomi noticed that his hands were shaking slightly. "And I've been looking for you for a very long time, sweetheart." "Richard Hale?" Carl's voice cracked slightly on the name. Even in his drunken state, recognition was dawning. "The Richard Hale? The billionaire?" Richard didn't take his eyes off Naomi. "I'm your father, little one. I know that might be hard to understand right now, but I promise you, I'm here to make sure no one ever hurts you again." The words hit Naomi like a physical blow. "Father? She had always wondered about the man who had given her life, and then disappeared before she was born. Lisa never talked about him, just saying he was gone whenever Naomi asked. She had created elaborate fantasies about him. Sometimes he was a soldier fighting in a distant war, sometimes he was a doctor saving lives in faraway places, and sometimes he was just a regular man who didn't know she existed. But never in her wildest dreams had she imagined he might be real, might be looking for her, might burst through their door like a superhero just when she needed saving most. "You're lying," Carl snarled, some of his confidence returning. "Lisa told me the father was some deadbeat who ran off. She said he didn't want anything to do with the kid." Richard's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Lisa told you a lot of things, apparently. But the truth has a way of coming to light eventually." He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, moving carefully so as not to alarm Naomi. What he pulled out made Carl's face go white, a thick manila envelope that looked official and important. "DNA test results," Richard said simply. "Court documents. Birth certificate. Everything I need to prove that Naomi is my daughter. Everything I need to prove that I've been searching for her since the day I found out she existed." Naomi stared at the papers in his hands, her mind racing. If this man was really her father, then why hadn't he been there? Why had she spent 8 years believing she wasn't wanted, wasn't worth fighting for? As if reading her thoughts, Richard's expression grew pained. "I know you must have questions, Naomi. I know this must be confusing and scary. But I need you to know that I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped wanting you in my life." "That's impossible," Carl said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Lisa would have told me if..." "Lisa lied?" The words dropped into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that seemed to affect everyone differently. "She's been lying for 8 years. To me. To you. And most importantly, to Naomi." Naomi felt something crack open inside her chest, not the painful breaking she had felt when Carl grabbed her, but something different. Something that felt almost like hope, but sharper and more dangerous. Hope could be crushed. Hope could be taken away. But this feeling, this possibility that maybe she wasn't alone in the world after all, felt too big and too real to be destroyed by disappointment. Richard stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe now, Naomi. Somewhere no one will ever raise a hand to you again. Would you like that?" Before she could answer, Carl stepped forward, his face flushed red with anger and desperation. "Now wait just a minute. You can't just walk in here and..." Richard's transformation was instant and terrifying. The gentle man who had been speaking softly to Naomi vanished, replaced by someone who radiated power and barely controlled fury. He straightened to his full height, and suddenly the cramped apartment seemed even smaller, as if his presence was sucking all the air out of the room. "I can't?" Richard's voice was deadly quiet. "Watch me." Carl took an involuntary step backward, but his pride and the alcohol in his system made him double down on his bravado. "You think because you got money, you can just waltz in here and take whatever you want? Lisa's my woman now, and that makes Naomi my responsibility." "Your responsibility?" Richard's laugh was like breaking glass. "Tell me, Carl, how long have you been taking responsibility for my daughter? How long have you been grabbing her hard enough to leave marks? How long have you been making her afraid to breathe in her own home?" Naomi watched from her position against the refrigerator, clutching her sketchbook so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She had never seen anyone stand up to Carl before. Her mother certainly never did. Lisa just tried to smooth things over, to keep the peace, to make sure Carl's anger didn't escalate beyond what they could handle. But this man, this Richard who claimed to be her father, wasn't trying to keep the peace. He was declaring war. "I never laid a hand on that girl," Carl lied, his voice getting louder and more defensive. "You got no right coming in here making accusations. You don't know nothing about how things work in the real world." "The real world?" Richard pulled out his phone and began scrolling through something. "Is the real world this?" He turned the screen toward Carl, and Naomi could see it was a photograph, one that made Carl's face drain of color. "That's Naomi's school nurse report from last month," Richard continued, his voice growing more dangerous with each word. "Unexplained bruises on her arms. She told the nurse she fell downstairs that don't exist in this building. The nurse was concerned enough to file a report with Child Services." Carl's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Naomi remembered that day. She had worn long sleeves to school for a week afterward, hoping nobody would notice the finger-shaped marks that had taken so long to fade. "And this," Richard swiped to another image, "is from her teacher. Naomi's been falling asleep in class, jumping at sudden noises, and hoarding food from lunch like she's not sure when she'll eat again. Sound familiar?" "You can't prove nothing," Carl said, but his voice was weaker now, the fight starting to drain out of him as he realized he was in over his head. "I can prove everything," Richard snapped. "I've had investigators watching this building for weeks. I have photographs, witness statements, and medical reports. I have enough evidence to not only take Naomi away from here, but to make sure you never get the chance to hurt another child again." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Carl's face went through several different colors before settling on a sickly gray that matched the walls of the apartment. Naomi felt something warm and unfamiliar spreading through her chest. For the first time in her life, someone was fighting for her. Someone was angry on her behalf. Someone cared enough to gather evidence, to hire investigators, to storm through their door like a one-man army with nothing but her safety in mind. "Now you listen to me very carefully," Richard continued, taking another step closer to Carl. "You are going to stay away from my daughter. You are not going to touch her, speak to her, or even look at her. If I find out you've so much as raised your voice in her direction, I will use every resource at my disposal to destroy you. Do you understand me?" Carl nodded quickly, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air in the apartment. "I can't hear you," Richard said. "I understand," Carl mumbled. "Good." Richard turned back to Naomi, his expression softening again. "Come here, sweetheart. Come to me." Naomi looked between the two men, her mind racing. Everything was happening so fast. This morning she had been invisible, trying to survive another day in a world that seemed determined to crush her. Now there was this stranger, this father, who wanted to take her away from everything she had ever known. It wasn't a good life, but it was the only life she knew. What if this was all some kind of mistake? What if he changed his mind? What if he turned out to be just as bad as Carl, but better at hiding it? "It's okay to be scared," Richard said gently, as if he could read her thoughts. "I know this is overwhelming. I know you don't know me yet. But I promise you, Naomi, you never have to be afraid again." Slowly, carefully, Naomi pushed herself away from the refrigerator. Her injured foot left small red spots on the floor as she walked toward Richard, her sketchbook still clutched against her chest like a shield. When she reached him, Richard knelt down again so they were eye to eye. Up close, she could see that he had been crying. There were tear tracks on his cheeks that he had tried to wipe away. "I'm sorry," he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. I'm sorry you had to go through this alone." And then, for the first time in 3 years, Naomi felt safe enough to let herself be small. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Richard's neck, breathing in the smell of his expensive cologne and the leather of his jacket. He felt solid and real and strong, like nothing in the world could hurt her as long as his arms were around her. Richard's embrace was careful and gentle, as if he was afraid she might break. His hands smoothed over her hair, and she could feel him shaking with barely contained emotion. "Daddy," she whispered into his ear, trying out the word for the first time in her life. She felt him take a sharp breath, his arms tightening around her just slightly. From across the room, Carl cleared his throat. "Look, this is all very touching, but Lisa ain't gonna be happy when she gets home and finds out you took her daughter." Richard's entire body went rigid. Slowly, he pulled back from Naomi and looked at her face. "Naomi," he said carefully, "where is your mother right now?" "She's at work," Naomi said quietly, still clinging to Richard's hand. At the office building downtown. She cleans there after her diner job. She won't be home until midnight. Richard's jaw tightened as he processed this information. He stood up slowly, his protective stance over Naomi never wavering, but his attention was now focused on Carl with laser-like intensity. So you're telling me, Richard said, his voice dangerously calm, that Lisa leaves this child alone with you every night? While she works 2 jobs to support a family that includes a grown man who contributes nothing but violence and fear? Carl's face flushed red. I contribute plenty. This is my apartment, Your apartment? Richard pulled out his phone again and scrolled to a different screen. According to the lease agreement my investigators obtained, this apartment is rented under Lisa Martinez's name. She's been paying the rent for 3 years while you've been unemployed and drinking your way through her grocery money. The silence that followed was deafening. Naomi looked up at Carl, seeing him in a completely different light. She had always assumed he was the one taking care of them, that they owed him something for letting them live here. The idea that her mother had been supporting Carl all this time, that he had been taking advantage of her desperation and loneliness, made something hot and angry unfurl in her chest. That's not... Carl started, but Richard cut him off. Not what? Not true? Richard's voice was getting louder now, his careful control beginning to slip. Let me tell you what else isn't true. The story Lisa told you about me being a deadbeat father who abandoned them. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder, spreading documents across the small kitchen table that was still sticky with spilled beer. This is a DNA test I had done 6 months ago when I first suspected Naomi might be my daughter, Richard said, pointing to an official-looking document. 99.9% probability of paternity. Naomi stared at the paper, seeing her name printed there in official black letters next to his. It made everything real in a way that felt almost overwhelming. And this, Richard continued, pulling out another document, is a bank statement showing 8 years of child support payments I've been making to a trust account that Lisa was supposed to have access to. $25,000 a year, every year, since Naomi was born. Carl's face went white. That's impossible. Lisa would have told me if there was money? Richard's laugh was bitter and cold. Lisa knew about every penny. She set up the trust account herself when Naomi was born. The only condition was that she had to provide regular updates about Naomi's well-being and allow visitation rights. Naomi felt the world spinning around her. $25,000 a year? Where had that money gone? They lived in poverty, her mother working herself to exhaustion just to keep food on the table and the lights on. If there had been money all along. 8 years ago, Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion. Lisa called me and said she was moving to California with Naomi. She said she didn't want me in their lives anymore, that it would be better for everyone if I just stayed away. I was young and stupid and thought maybe she was right. Maybe a wealthy single father wasn't what Naomi needed. He looked down at Naomi, his eyes bright with unshed tears. But I never stopped sending the money. I never stopped hoping that someday she'd change her mind and let me be part of your life. Then what happened? Naomi whispered, her voice small and confused. Richard's expression hardened again. 6 months ago, I hired a private investigator to check on you both. I just wanted to know that you were okay, that the money was helping, that you were happy. What I found out was that Lisa never moved to California. You've been living here, in this apartment, for the past 3 years. The trust account had been completely emptied within the first year, and Lisa had changed her phone number and address to avoid my calls. The pieces were falling into place in Naomi's mind, creating a picture that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Her mother had lied to both of them. She had taken money that was meant for Naomi's care and spent it on, what? Certainly not on improving their living conditions or getting them out of this terrible situation. Where did the money go? Carl asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard pulled out another document, bank records that showed large cash withdrawals, payments to various creditors, and transfers to accounts that Naomi didn't recognize. Gambling debts, Richard said simply. Lisa had a serious gambling problem 8 years ago when she first contacted me. I thought the child support would help stabilize things for Naomi, but instead it just enabled Lisa to dig herself deeper into debt. When the money ran out, she was too ashamed to contact me and ask for help. Naomi felt something breaking inside her chest, but it wasn't the same kind of breaking she was used to. This was different. It was the sound of illusions shattering, of false beliefs crumbling away to reveal an ugly truth underneath. Her mother hadn't been working 2 jobs because they were poor despite having no help. She had been working 2 jobs because she had gambled away $250,000 that was supposed to be for Naomi's future. I don't understand, Naomi said, her voice small and lost. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she tell me you were looking for me? Richard knelt down beside her again, his hands gentle on her shoulders. I think she was scared, sweetheart. Scared that you'd be angry with her. Scared that I'd take you away. Scared that she'd lose the only good thing in her life. But she did lose me, Naomi whispered, tears beginning to fall freely down her cheeks. She lost me the first time Carl hit me and she didn't stop him. She lost me every time she chose to protect him instead of me. The front door opened with a loud creak, and they all turned to see a figure silhouetted in the doorway. Lisa stood there, still wearing her cleaning uniform, her keys dangling from her hand as she took in the scene, Richard's expensive suit, Carl's pale and frightened face, and Naomi's tear-stained cheeks. What's going on here? Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence stretched between them like a tightrope, everyone frozen in place as Lisa slowly processed the scene before her. Her eyes moved from Richard's expensive suit to the scattered documents on the table, to Carl's guilty expression, and finally to Naomi, who was still holding tightly to Richard's hand. Richard? Lisa's voice cracked on his name. What are you doing here? Hello, Lisa. Richard's voice was controlled, but Naomi could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a fire. I think you know exactly why I'm here. Lisa's face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, guilt, and finally a desperate kind of defiance. She stepped fully into the apartment and closed the door behind her, as if that simple action could somehow contain the explosion that was about to happen. You can't just break into our home, she said, her voice getting stronger. This is kidnapping. I'll call the police. Please do, Richard said calmly. I'd love to explain to them how you've been cashing child support checks for 8 years while letting your boyfriend abuse our daughter. Lisa's face crumpled. Carl doesn't abuse her. He has a temper sometimes, but he's never seriously hurt. Never seriously hurt her? Richard's control finally snapped. Lisa, look at her. Look at your daughter. She jumps every time someone raises their voice. She hoards food like she's not sure when she'll eat again. She has bruises on her arms that she's learned to lie about. Naomi watched her mother's face as the words hit her. She wanted to see recognition there, wanted to see her mother finally understand what had been happening right under her nose. But instead, she saw something worse. She saw that her mother had known all along. You knew, Naomi whispered, the words falling from her lips like stones. You knew he was hurting me, and you didn't stop him. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. Baby, it's complicated. Adults have complicated relationships, and sometimes don't. Richard's voice cut through her excuses like a blade. Don't you dare try to explain away child abuse to an 8-year-old. Don't you dare make her think this is normal or acceptable. Carl, who had been silent since Lisa's arrival, suddenly stepped forward. Now hold on just a minute. I've been taking care of that girl for 3 years while her real daddy was nowhere to be found. I got rights too. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard turned to face Carl with an expression that made Naomi take an involuntary step backward. Rights? Richard's voice was deadly quiet. You want to talk about rights? You have the right to remain silent when the police arrest you for child abuse. You have the right to an attorney when I press charges against you. Those are the only rights you have where my daughter is concerned. Carl's bravado crumbled instantly. You can't prove nothing. It's her word against mine. Richard pulled out his phone and showed the screen to both Carl and Lisa. Actually, I can prove everything. My investigators have been documenting this situation for weeks. Video surveillance from the building across the street showing Naomi arriving at school with visible injuries. Audio recordings from a listening device I had installed in the apartment. Lisa gasped. That's illegal. You can't record people without their consent. In cases of suspected child abuse, the law is quite clear, Richard said smoothly. Especially when one parent has reasonable grounds to believe their child is in danger. Naomi looked up at her mother, hoping to see some sign that Lisa was going to fight for her, that she was going to choose her daughter over the man who had been terrorizing them both. But instead, she saw her mother looking at Carl with something that might have been apology. I'm sorry, Lisa whispered to Carl. I never meant for things to get this complicated. The words hit Naomi like a physical blow. Her mother was apologizing to Carl, to the man who had hurt her, who had made her afraid to exist in her own home, and she was calling Richard's presence complicated. I want to go with him, Naomi said suddenly, her voice cutting through the adult conversation. I want to go with my daddy. Lisa's face crumpled. Baby, you don't understand. He's been gone your whole life. I'm the one who's been here, who's taken care of you. Taken care of me? Naomi's voice was getting stronger, fed by anger she didn't even know she possessed. You left me alone with him every night. You knew he hurt me and you did nothing. That's not taking care of me, that's abandoning me. Naomi, please, Lisa begged, reaching out toward her daughter. I know I made mistakes, but I love you. I've always loved you. If you loved me, you would have protected me, Naomi said, and the simple truth of those words seemed to echo in the small apartment. Richard knelt down beside Naomi again. Are you sure, sweetheart? This is a big decision. If you come with me, everything will change. Naomi looked around the cramped apartment one last time, at the stained walls, at Carl cowering by the kitchen counter, at her mother crying silent tears that somehow managed to make Naomi feel guilty even now. Then she looked up at Richard, at this man who had spent 8 years sending money he thought was helping her, who had hired investigators to find her when she disappeared, who had burst through their door like an avenging angel when she needed him most. I'm sure, she said firmly. I want to go home with you. Carl suddenly stepped forward, his face red with desperate anger. You can't just take her. This is still my house, and what I say goes. He reached toward Naomi, his hand extended as if to grab her arm again. But before he could make contact, Richard moved with lightning speed, catching Carl's wrist and twisting it just enough to make the older man cry out in pain. Touch my daughter again, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper, and I will destroy you completely. Do you understand me? Carl nodded frantically, his face white with pain and fear. Richard released him and turned back to Lisa. I'm taking Naomi with me tonight. Tomorrow, my lawyers will file for emergency custody. If you want to fight this, you're welcome to try. But I should warn you, I have 8 years of evidence showing parental neglect and endangerment. I have financial records showing you stole $250,000 meant for our daughter's care. And now I have proof that you've been allowing your boyfriend to abuse her. Lisa's sobs grew louder, but she didn't argue. Richard looked down at Naomi. Go pack whatever you want to take with you, sweetheart. We're going home. Naomi's room didn't take long to pack. Her entire world fit into a single grocery bag, 3 changes of clothes, her toothbrush, a stuffed elephant that her mother had given her years ago, and most importantly, her sketchbook filled with drawings of the life she had always dreamed of living. As she folded her few possessions, she could hear the muffled voices of the adults in the kitchen. Her mother was crying and pleading, Carl was making threats he couldn't back up, and through it all, Richard's voice remained calm and steady, like a lighthouse beam cutting through a storm. When she emerged from the bedroom with her bag, Richard was standing by the front door, checking something on his phone. Lisa was slumped at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, while Carl had retreated to the living room and was nursing what looked like his 10th beer of the day. Ready? Richard asked gently, taking her small bag and offering her his free hand. Naomi nodded, but as they reached the door, she turned back to look at her mother one last time. Lisa raised her head, her face streaked with tears and mascara, looking older and more broken than Naomi had ever seen her. "I do love you, baby," Lisa whispered. "I know I messed up, but I do love you." For just a moment, Naomi felt the familiar pull of guilt and sympathy that had kept her silent about Carl's abuse for so long. But then she remembered the sound of his hand coming down toward her face, remembered her mother's apologies to him instead of her, remembered 8 years of believing she wasn't worth fighting for. "I know," Naomi said quietly. "But love isn't enough if you don't protect the people you love." The words seemed to hit Lisa like a physical blow, and she buried her face in her hands again as Richard led Naomi out of the apartment, and into a future that felt both terrifying and magnificent. The ride to Richard's penthouse was like entering a different universe. His car was larger and more comfortable than her entire bedroom had been, with leather seats that seemed to wrap around her like a hug and windows tinted so dark that the world outside looked like a movie playing on a screen. Richard didn't try to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. Instead, he let Naomi process everything that had happened, occasionally glancing at her in the rearview mirror to make sure she was okay. When they pulled up to his building, Naomi pressed her face to the window and stared upward until her neck hurt. She couldn't even see the top floors. They disappeared into the night sky like they were reaching for the stars themselves. The lobby was all marble and gold, with a fountain in the center that was taller than Carl and probably cost more than 3 years of her mother's rent. The elevator that carried them to the 42nd floor was so smooth and quiet that Naomi barely realized they were moving until her ears popped from the altitude. "Welcome home," Richard said softly as he opened the door to his penthouse. Naomi stepped inside and felt her breath catch in her throat. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the entire city spread out below them like a carpet of stars. The living room was larger than their entire apartment had been, with furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum and artwork on the walls that seemed to glow with their own inner light. But what caught her attention most was what Richard had prepared for her arrival. On the massive dining table sat art supplies, not the cheap crayons and copy paper she was used to, but real artist supplies. Professional colored pencils, watercolor paints, brushes of every size, and thick, beautiful paper that felt like silk under her fingertips. "I noticed you like to draw," Richard said, standing behind her as she touched the supplies with reverent fingers. "I thought you might like some proper materials." Naomi turned to look at him, this man who had known her for less than 3 hours but had somehow understood something about her that the people who raised her had never bothered to notice. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it more deeply than she had ever meant anything in her life. Richard led her down a long hallway to a bedroom that was bigger than most people's entire homes. It had its own bathroom with a bathtub deep enough to swim in, a walk-in closet that was currently empty but wouldn't be for long, and windows that looked out over the glittering city below. But the thing that made Naomi's eyes fill with tears was the bed. It was enormous and covered in soft blankets and pillows that looked like clouds. More importantly, it was hers. For the first time in her life, she had a space that was entirely her own, where she could close the door and know that she was safe. "I know this is overwhelming," Richard said, sitting on the edge of the bed while Naomi explored her new room. "I know everything has changed very quickly, and it's okay if you need time to adjust." Naomi nodded, settling into the chair by the window with her precious sketchbook in her lap. She opened it to a fresh page and began to draw, her pencil moving automatically across the paper. This time, instead of drawing the house she wished she lived in, she drew the one she was actually in. She drew the enormous windows, the comfortable furniture, and in one of the rooms she drew a little girl who looked just like her, but this little girl was smiling. As she drew, Richard's phone buzzed with notifications that made his jaw tighten. Naomi could see the stress lines appearing around his eyes as he read whatever messages were coming through. "What's wrong?" she asked, looking up from her drawing. Richard hesitated for a moment, then seemed to decide that she deserved the truth. "Your mother's hired a lawyer. She's going to fight for custody after all." The words sent a chill through Naomi's chest, but it wasn't the same kind of fear she used to feel. This was different, sharper and more focused. "Will I have to go back?" she asked. Richard's expression grew fierce with determination. Not if I have anything to say about it. But it might get complicated, sweetheart. Court battles can be long and difficult. Naomi looked out at the city lights twinkling below them, then back at her drawing. For the first time in 8 years, she had hope. Real, solid hope that couldn't be taken away by empty beer bottles or raised voices. I'm not afraid anymore, she said, and realized with surprise that it was true. Whatever happens, I'm not afraid. As if summoned by her words, Richard's phone rang. The caller ID showed his lawyer's name, and Naomi could tell by Richard's expression that the real fight was just beginning. But for tonight, she was safe. For tonight, she was home. And tomorrow, they would face whatever came next together.